Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where in the world you are right now. My name is Chris Barrett. I'm the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Professor of Applied Economics and Management and the International Professor of Agriculture in the Dyson School at Cornell University. I'm also the co-editor-in-chief of the academic journal Food Policy. And I want to thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a really interesting discussion. Please note this event is being recorded and will be viewable at this same URL after today's program. So feel free to share this link with colleagues within and beyond the Cornell community. You may also submit questions in the chat as we go. We'll be taking audience questions a little later in the program this hour. And you may open that chat by just clicking on the dialog box in the top right of your video player. Throughout our discussion, we'll also share URLs, links to particular websites and resources based off of some of the commentary you're hearing. So keep a heads up for those. Those resources should be readily accessible. And if you're watching the archived recording, those links will be available in the overview section just beneath the video. Bios for each of our distinguished speakers can be found on the eCornell event registration page. It's an extremely impressive bunch with deep connections to both Cornell and to the topic of today's discussion, which is how can the private sector help advance local, national, and global food security goals? So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick off our discussion, first by turning to Ann Byrne. Ann received her PhD in 2021 from the Applied Economics and Management program run out of the Dyson School. She now works as a research agricultural economist for the Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, ERS. Ann has built an enviable reputation as an internationally recognized expert at a young age, I would add, on the private nonprofit food assistance sector. She's published cutting-edge research on food bank and food pantry operations, barriers to prospective client use, et cetera. And along with Professor David Just from the Dyson School, she's guest editing a special virtual collection of papers on private food assistance operations worldwide in the journal Food Policy. And one of the things your research has shown is that there's been a huge change in the landscape of private food assistance over the past decade or so, even before the massive surge in demand for food bank and food pantry services during the initial months of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you please describe for us some of the scaling and professionalization of the private nonprofit food assistance sector and some of the ongoing challenges of inducing food insecure people to avail themselves of those services?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to be among the panelists and Chris, the moderator here. I'm humbled to be here. So I think one of the important things to consider with food banking and food pantries is that the history of food banking is pretty recent. So food pantries and soup kitchens have been around for a long time, but food banks really came into being in the 60s. So, 50 years ago. Many of us have grandparents that are older than that. And in those 50 years, a lot has changed. A lot has really changed in how food banks operate, where they operate. There's been an expansion in the number of food banks. There's been an expansion in the type. Many of them have gone from sort of smaller scale donations from individuals to larger corporate donations, larger cash donations so that they can purchase food. That really changes their supply chain management. It changes their distribution. It changes the health of the food that they're distributing. And there's also been an effort to better meet the needs of the clients that they serve. So, one example is the mobile food pantries that have sprung up in many rural counties. Here in upstate New York, the Food Bank for the Southern Tier operates an award-winning mobile food pantry system that goes out to areas that are underserved and brings the food to to the clients rather than relying on a brick and mortar pantry to do that. There's also been an emergence of more pantries on college campuses, in medical facilities, and the idea being that you can really meet people's needs by meeting them where they are. And then, there's also been some advances in terms of the technology that exists within the food bank network, because there are so many more food banks, because technology itself has advanced, and because of the Feeding America network, which has sprung up to kind of network individual banks across the country. So now we have this really robust online auction system, which allows food banks to kind of share food that they receive in donations. So let's say one food bank has a surplus of canned soup, maybe they can send it to a different food bank that's in need. So these kinds of technologies have really changed. And so what food pantries and food banks looked like 50 years ago is not what they look like today.
Thanks so much, Anne. That's really fascinating. It truly has become an industry just with a different bottom line than the commercial food distribution industries, which leads us to our next speaker, Miguel Gomez. Miguel holds the Dyson School Professorship named for Robert Tobin. Bob Tobin was a longtime senior food retail executive, a real leader in the industry. Miguel, you direct Cornell's Food Industry Management Program that hosts the longest running food industry executive education program in the world. You've trained senior executives throughout the food manufacturing, retail, and wholesale industries globally. How do you see the industry changing to address food security challenges locally, nationally, and globally?
Thank you, Chris, for the generous introduction as well, and it's a pleasure to be here. So before answering that question, I just want to take a step back and remind us that the food industry is responsible for the private sector, is responsible for the majority of the food that is produced, distributed, and retailed in the world, worldwide. Second, we are talking about a system that is truly global. Global food supply chains dominate the scene of the distribution, production, and consumption of food. So this is important because there are, when we think about food security, we need to think about two aspects. One, mentioned by Anne, is thinking about consumers, the consumers of food, but also there is another aspect to food security, which is all the people and families involved in the production and distribution of food worldwide. So when we think about the consumer, we are seeing two aspects in which the private sector, the food industry, is contributing to solve the problem of food security. One is very relevant to what Anne just mentioned, is there are many new businesses using technology in order to repurpose food from the commercial sector at different levels of the supply chain, retail, processing, distribution, wholesale, and production, and developing business models, platforms in which information is key to understand when food is going to be wasted in the commercial sector, and selling these products, food products, to the non-for-profit sector to serve the need. So examples of this is Eat Well in Boston, Robbie's in the Rubble in the UK, and you go to Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and all these new business startups serving the food, repurposing food from the commercial sector to the food security network happening. And these businesses are led by young talent. The second one is responsive food operations. The food retailer with the largest number of stores today in the US is not Walmart, is the Dollar General. And Dollar General today, a large portion of the food space is food, but not only canned food, but also fresh foods, frozen foods, and minimally processed foods. So industry is also understanding that the level of aggregation of products that families in need also need access to diversified diet in which to solve the problem of for a nutrition, for a healthy diet. So now when we go to the people working in the food industry, just let me give you an example from Latin America, where I come from. 80% of the food that is produced in Latin America and consumed in Latin America come from small farmers. So, and these small farmers usually sell to big food processors, food retailers, and big companies. So there is a huge role that the food industry is playing in developing business models in procurement that work for everybody, what we call sustainability in procurement, to sustain the economic, not only the economic sustainability of small and medium-sized farmers, but also the preservation of natural resources, because small farmers depend on these resources to continue production in the future. And I just want to close this, Chris, with brief mention of how fragile food supply chains are today, has been demonstrated by the global pandemic of COVID-19, in which we saw all sorts of disruptions. So I think something that the industry is understanding is to move from a model of just-in-time model of production to just-in-case model of production, to make sure food is available where is needed, when is needed.
Thanks, Miguel. That's really fascinating. You spoke of globalizing food supply chains, and you spoke of the rise of ESG concerns within the food industry, which leads us naturally to our next speaker. Devry Bufner-Vorwerk has been a leading voice on global food value chains for 20 plus years, since she completed her Master of Science degree in agricultural resource and managerial economics at Cornell back in '99. By the way, I emphasize that Devry's thesis won the National Award for the best MS thesis, and she also won the college's Outstanding Teaching Assistant Award. So Devry was a rock star student here, and she's gone on to continue to be a rock star, holding a range of high-profile positions in government, boards of nonprofits, and especially in the private sector, especially with Cargill, handling global business relations in Latin America, in the Asia-Pacific region, and with the EU and the World Trade Organization, WTO. She's been a senior executive at industry disruptors like Grubhub before starting her own firm now that's focused on placing ESG at the center of business strategy. Devry, you've seen a lot of change in the food industry over the last 20 or so years, especially when it comes to how companies approach food security issues. What has changed at kind of the highest levels? Why and where do you think it's all going next, or at least where should the private sector go next on food security issues?
Thank you, Chris, and it's an honor to be here, and I do appreciate the shout out for Cornell. I keep the thesis right up here on my bookshelf, which shows how how meaningful it was to be at Cornell and to set out on this path. And when you ask, so what has changed with the private sector, I will focus on a lot of what has changed. And then I think we'll probably also talk about what hasn't and what needs to change, right? But what I've seen since I, left Cornell in 1999 is, at that point in time, the world was coming together. There was a great convergence around what are the right ways to address food security and to do it by crossing borders. And so in 1999, we were all gathering as food industry players, government, civil society, and private sector to figure out how do we implement what has been the last round of true agreement on food policy and agriculture policy, which was the Uruguay round, agreement on agriculture. 20 years, we saw this grand convergence, at least, around how do we treat food security not just as a local issue, but as also we need to understand our actions within our borders impact outside of our borders. And now what we are seeing is this deep to government. What I would say is consistent is the continued integrated cooperation of private sector and civil society. That is really been a remarkable change over the last 20 years is that these actors, as you know, as Anne is talking about, the food banks and linking with private sector and all the innovation that's been taking place. I mean, that's been a really positive change, is that the private sector has really embraced and integrated the social needs, the environmental needs of civil society. What I will say is that when I got the call to focus on what can the private sector do, I thought, gee, I've been talking about this for over 20 years, but it's exactly the right question. And why? It's because the private sector has changed quite a bit. There are new actors and new entrants, as Miguel is mentioning, and I've been able to see that, as part of a global organization, a global company invested in 70 countries, and also as part of a US-based mobile delivery operation. And what I will say is that these new entrants are not only disrupting, they're agitating the traditional players. And that is, in my mind, a positive thing. What we're seeing is that the traditional industry that was consistently asked to solve some of these problems, people got tired of it. And so capital and innovation and new ideas started to come in, and I know we'll talk about those. What I also want to point out is that my grand sort of learning, and one of the new messages I'm consistently sending is that all companies, not just what we would define as food companies, need to be looking at themselves as a company that is part of the food security equation, because they're all operating in communities around the world. And so we just saw with the Food Systems Summit, the UN Food Systems Summit, that there was some concern that corporates were involved. And my bigger concern was that not all the right corporates were at the table. So the key opportunity that we're seeing is the sort of the collision of the traditional food industry players. We need technology companies at the table. Some of these technology companies, and remember, I was on an executive team of a mobile food delivery company. Some of these technology companies have yet to untap the potential to acknowledge that they're part of the food industry. We need transportation, we need telecom, financial services, shipping, all at the table around the solutions. And I will say what has not changed, Chris, is the imperative. And I know for many of us in this industry, we've heard the numbers, but I'm going to put them out there. That over 800 million people are food insecure in one way, on the spectrum of food insecurity. And we've seen that increase. And I like to point out that David Beasley of the World Food Program is our best ambassador worldwide, along with many, many others who just continue to not even appeal to the food industry, but he's done, innovative, heckling of folks to say, hey, could you put a few $1 million here on Earth as it relates to food security instead of focused on space, right? So he was instrumental in getting Elon Musk to pay attention to it, and Jeff Bezos. So there's the imperative has not changed. I want to say that we still need to remain optimistic that the collaborative efforts are there, but we can even see today. I mean, there's conflict, there's agitations of war, there's famine as a result of climate change, et cetera. So we need to be thinking about how we're all going to come together collectively when the world right now is not necessarily focused on the collaboration that needs to take place.
Thank you, Deborah. That's really helpful insights. Disruption was an important theme in your comments, whether it's just disrupting how businesses work, disrupting who's at the table for high-level conversations, disruptive technologies like a food delivery platform. Let me ask the broader group, what are the big opportunities for productive disruption here to help advance food security goals, especially this decade in the coming next several years? What are the big risks posed by those disruptions as well, since the economist Joseph Schumpeter famously noted all successful innovation involves creative destruction. So how do we encourage responsible, innovative investment that advances food security goals rather than just predatory forms of innovation that may inadvertently aggravate current problems? Any thoughts, anyone?
Don't be shy, Miguel and Anne, because I'll always fill a vacuum.
Yeah, I can start my thoughts. We see this in my students at Cornell. We see young talent interested in these issues much more now with everything that we saw in the press in the past 2 years about supply chain disruptions, and young talent is interested, really interested in this problem. And I think they are able to bring all the things that Debbie just mentioned, all the knowledge on technology, bring innovation in logistics, bring innovation in business models that will allow the food industry to continue making contributions to the problem of food security.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, Debbie talked about kind of bringing people to the table, and an example that I think is sort of an interesting innovation is akin to what Miguel was talking about, and it's these sort of community grocery store operations, which are starting to pop up. And the research will show whether or not they're effective. And but the idea is you have sort of a repurposing of donated food, repackaged so that it's can be sold and is appealing, and so it's sort of a like the TJ Maxx model of grocery stores, if you will. And one of the players in that is Doug Rauch, who was the president and CEO of Trader Joe's. And so you have somebody from one sector kind of coming in and thinking about this problem and bringing the skills that they've generated in the previous sector. And so then you get this new platform and this new sort of delivery of food assistance, which again, we'll see how effective they are. We'll see how they permeate. But I think it's interesting to see how that shift of, different people from one part of the industry to another generates new ideas.
Yeah. I will just add on that I've done a lot of thinking around, the innovation issue, and the technology is our way forward and our way out. I do believe advancements in technology have always been the way out of agriculture. If you look at first when the tractor was, introduced, and just the innovation, the agriculture and food industry has embraced innovation from the start. The question is, where is the industry choosing to innovate? Are they innovating against the greatest needs and deploying capital against the greatest needs? One thing we have not mentioned here is that it's not just about the amount of food, because we all know that there's enough food in this world to feed every hungry individual. It becomes a sort of a supply and distribution issue. There's also a question around the quality and the type of food that people have access to. And so when we see innovation dollars perhaps going toward the least nutritious, least safe forms of food that mothers like me and fathers want to feed their children, you begin to ask, are we taking the short-term P&L, profit and loss approach, which my answer is yes, versus the longer term, how are we going to feed and nourish a society over the longer term. So the question around where is the innovation being capitalized is the first. And then I'll say one thing that industry players can do, and Miguel, you mentioned younger folks coming in, which is phenomenal. We've seen phenomenal disruption and what I would say is necessary agitation. But one thing folks can do as they start to think about deploying a technology against a problem is to sit with the whiteboard and say, all of these positive aspects are coming to play because of this technology. Let's just say sort of a mobile delivery option, et cetera. But we need to be responsible in thinking about some of the negative consequences, the negative externalities that come into play because of the technology. And this is where I also, Chris, want to make a pitch for play. I have observed lots of interest, lots of problem solving, lots of technology coming to the table, but perhaps not lots of understanding about the food industry itself, right? Food and nutrition is a science. And so as these players are introducing these technologies, they have to have a deep understanding of the food industry. And what better place to do it than Cornell? The types of innovations, as you know, Anne highlighted a few I want to highlight, are some around process, and Anne and Miguel have talked about it. But we've seen that private sector has started to not only be global player, and I will say about 14 to 20% of food crosses borders. So it's global to fill a need, but it's also very local, is that they've started to work with people who are on the ground, like David Hertz from Gastromotiva, who I found many years ago, and we have partnered since then around how do we have global approaches but take local solutions. David's been building out solidarity kitchens with Gastromotiva across Brazil, and bringing in private industry players into places like deep into the Amazon, where there's hunger and malnutrition. We've seen the World Kitchens, the Jose Andres immediately going to the crisis. So that's an innovation in process. And then you've seen all these other innovations around CRISPR technology and new ways of getting products out there that will embrace. Vertical farming, we can talk a bit about that. Where does the future go with vertical farming versus using land-based farming? Plant-based innovations that 10 years ago folks would have said had dismissed. Those players continue to invest because they believe very much in advancing alternatives in plant-based diets. So with every innovation, Chris, comes a great opportunity to address food security, and also it needs to be put in place to understand how do we manage that technology and innovation appropriately.
I couldn't agree with you more, Devry, and thank you, Anne and Miguel, for your helpful insights there too. Your comments remind me, Devry, of a couple of startups from recent alums. Vertical farming, there's a startup called Kisano in India, developed by young guys, a recent Cornell grad, turning a profit within a couple of years, franchising the model they've got, including seed stock development, to other high quality greens producers in urban and peri-urban Asia. There's an operation also started by a young Cornellian, Hello Tractor. You talked about tractorization. Well, it hasn't really come to sub-Saharan Africa. So this clever young Cornellian realized we could use the same sort of digital platforms used by ride hailing services for those of us who want to catch a ride across Manhattan. You could do the same thing to help to create a rental market for farm equipment, enabling people to put their machinery to better use across a broader area, and allowing people who couldn't afford to buy a piece of heavy machinery that would improve their productivity, giving them access to that at an affordable price without massive search costs. So there are all sorts of these innovations that are helping to solve some of the problems that especially hold back places like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And a common denominator there is that these have Cornell origins. Cornell was a leader in the agricultural revolution that swept the US in the late 19th century and the early to mid 20th century. Cornell was one of the original land-grant universities that really originated very important advances in agricultural technologies and in institutional forms and policies. George Warren, for whom our building is named, was a real leader in establishing good farm policy in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. And then later, the Green Revolution. If there is a university most closely tied to the Green Revolution advances that won a Nobel Peace Prize for a plant breeder, quite remarkably, Norman Borlaug, that probably was Cornell, swept across Asia and Latin America in the 60s to the 80s, unfortunately, largely missed Sub-Saharan Africa. But here at the Dyson School, we've really internalized that spirit. Our tagline is, "Our business is a better world." And that tagline is meant to emphasize exactly the vision you articulated, Devry, that we can train next generation leaders who look beyond the quarterly P&L. They recognize that they can do well for themselves and for their communities by solving pressing problems, whether they're local problems or global problems or both. And food insecurity is just one of those. So I'm interested in hearing how each of you sees Cornell exercising its longstanding leadership in addressing food security questions today and the years ahead, since the nature of the beast continues to change and the opportunities and challenges ahead of us continue to morph. Any thoughts on this, Anne? What can Cornell do?
I mean, I think that there's a tremendous opportunity at Cornell, partly because of where it's located and the access you have to local agriculture and local foods, and this land grant mission. And I think you see that at other land grant schools too, where you have a connection to agriculture and the ability for students who are studying economics to study agricultural economics, and to study topics at the intersection of food and economics. And we have, I think Cornell has just an outstanding collection of people, and that's really where good research, good ideas come from, or those conversations with people who are engaged and want to, and who bring creative ideas to the table. I certainly, that was my experience as a student there.
Hear, hear. Devery?
Well, what's on my mind is the power of the collective, first of all. I've run into Cornell colleagues and grads all around the world in some really interesting places. And I applaud you, Chris, and the Cornell as the broader university to figure out how do we harness the power of our graduates. So for those that are watching, I think it's on us to remain connected to Cornell, but we're around the world solving some of the biggest problems, Chris. And so it's just, it's really heartening to know that we're all out there. I would say that we can probably do better, right? At as alum come together. So that's on us and maybe on you all to think about. But the other thing is remaining connected allows Cornell to continue to innovate your education. The courses are very different. The school is the same, but also very different than when I graduated in 1999. And that is a good thing. Cornell is on the cutting edge of innovation. And I saw that because in my previous role, I was searching for a university who could figure out how do we bring the power of the entire university, not just the ag school, together around the sustainability question. And I remember sitting with you, Chris, and saying, look, in academia, it's very challenging to get out of your individual schools and say, okay, look, how do we work across? And so I have seen Cornell get out of its own way and come together and innovate so that industry can actually find the right portal to engage. Because as we've moved along in industry, where I started in 99 in my career is very different. Industry is taking an integrated approach. And so we need players like Cornell and other universities to bring that together. And the other thing I have seen Cornell doing is the work of what I don't even know if it's gone beyond A5, Chris, but the broader global university partnership where you're working with partners like Wageningen and UC Davis and your partners in Brazil and China. Again, stepping out of your own way for the greater good and saying, how do we bring together these universities and collectively address the issues? Because we all know that we're but one actor, and Cornell's but one actor, but gee, the value of my degree just keeps going up because of the great work that's being done there. And Miguel, to folks like you who are there doing the hard work of educating the future.
I'm glad to hear that, Devery.
Yeah.
Nelson Rockefeller once said when he was governor, Cornell is land grant university to the world. Miguel, you're deeply embedded in many of the ways in which Cornell is trying to attack food security issues locally and globally. What do you see happening?
Yeah, Chris, complementing what Anne and Devery just say, I think Cornell has a big responsibility. Why? Because there are just a few universities in the world that have all the expertise that is necessary to address the problems of food security. If you think about Cornell, there is knowledge from genetics to production agriculture to distribution, we have top department food science. We have very strong programs in the food sector with the food service and the supermarket sector. We have a wonderful business school. So I think is what we call from gene to table. You will find expertise in Cornell, not only in faculty students, but also in our alumni base to tackle this problem. So I think Cornell has a big responsibility and big opportunities. And I think it's up to us in teaching and in research. For example, in teaching, I am very fan of experiential classes that involve students and faculty from different disciplines, focusing on a specific problem in the food sector. And we are having more and more courses of that nature at Cornell. And I think we need to increase them more. I think we need to engage more with our alumni working in the private sector, in the food sector, to conduct meaningful research with our talented students and faculty.
Great comments. Thank you, Miguel. So one theme that runs through each of your comments, and picking up in particular Miguel's last point, is they're really exciting private sector career opportunities that exist for those who would like to commit themselves to addressing food security challenges. Going private sector, whether for-profit or in the non-for-profit sectors, gives you increasing opportunities to use cutting-edge finance, accounting, logistics, management, marketing training. It's not like this requires just weekend volunteer work at a soup kitchen. This is increasingly a professionalized career space to solve food security challenges. How do you see today's Dyson School graduates using their skills in private enterprises to help solve the formidable challenges of food insecurity? If there were one brief message for a couple of graduating seniors on how they might pursue that private sector career to have real impact, what would it be?
I'm going to chime in as a public employee, and I think a point that I think is important to make, and I think Devery's career really speaks to this, is that there's both public and private, and there's both there's efforts from multiple angles, and there's interactions between those efforts, and I think understanding both is really important. I think one example is you take the SNAP program, or SNAP, I guess the P is a program, but that's a huge federal program, but it's those dollars are spent at private businesses, so there's this relationship back and forth, and I think that my advice is to figure out the landscape and figure out the resources that are available across the board.
Thanks, Anne. Miguel, thoughts? You interact with these students?
Yeah, so very briefly, I don't need to convince students nowadays about working in food security issues. As I mentioned before, all the publicity that we just got because of the problems of supply chain disruptions in the pandemic from many angles, many students have stopped at my office that were initially interested in other areas and say, how can I be involved in understanding these issues better? But many of them are seeing this also as a great opportunity to do business and to innovate and to make contribution at the same time. So I think it's not very hard to convince the students that I interact at Cornell in that focusing on private solutions, again, taking into account the importance of policy to solve these problems and to make good business out of it is a win-win situation. And I think this is a unique opportunity.
Yeah, I'll just say, I often joke that probably 20, 30 years ago, I was sitting on a plane and somebody asked me, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm an agricultural economist, and I work on, how we move food across borders. And the person looked at me and said, you chose that? And I was thinking, well, of course I chose that. Of course, right? And now I think, to Miguel's point, there's no more reason to convince people to choose it. If you're a Cornell grad coming out, my message to you is you can be anything you want to be in this industry, because we're at the, first of all, the one thing that unites humanity, humans across the globe, no matter what our differences are, is food and the need for food and water, right? So you're at the center of everything that allows humanity to move forward. So that's the first thing. The next thing is don't worry about your career evolving. You will have many transformations, and you can stay connected to this industry throughout your entire career as things change. And one thing I would point out is that the grand effort to decarbonize the world right now, and this is something that grads coming out of Cornell, Chris, I mean, this is their Nobel Prize challenge. How do they put themselves in the center of the decarbonized future? And that comes into everything from how do we establish a price of carbon that can be priced in, to the carbon sequestration that's going on as it relates to how farmers are now finding value in the way that they farm. And I mean, not just carbon markets, but also innovation around how we'll use alternative forms of energy. It's a daunting thought and task to think about how we're going to do this, but at the same time, you can get out and do anything you want as a Cornell grad with this degree. And the one thing I'll also add is, as Cornell, we shouldn't just be thinking about our students as the grads that are coming out now. There are people who have converted in other industries who are now also saying, how do I get in? How do I become part of this? I have seen so many conversions from people being in banks to deciding, I want to take this and apply it to the grand solution of how we're going to feed people and also make sure our planet survives. So there's great opportunity there, as well as to bring on new students who have been in the private sector 20, 30 years. So it's a great moment. If you chose Cornell and you chose that, this area, welcome, and we'll stand back and see what you can do. Anything.
I couldn't agree with you more, Devry. Your comments remind me, I too see students really increasingly passionate about food issues in ways they weren't 20 years ago, even really a decade ago. And I just proving I'm a nerd, think of the etymology of the word companion. It comes from the Roman come together and panis, bread. Our companionship is around coming together around food. And we sometimes forget that food is not just something everybody eats every day, but it is really central to human relationships. So I think it's an incredibly exciting space to be in for a wide range of reasons. We have a bunch of questions coming in, so let me just pull a few of them and offer them to you. One we've sort of tackled already. Karen asks, how as an individual can I make a difference? What can I do to help? Anne, any suggestions for Karen? Or really tell you what, let me put out a couple and you think about that for just a moment and I'll tag each of you. And then the question from Will is, companies mostly rely on philanthropy and federal assistance programs to address food security in the US. Is there more they can do in their commercial activities? Maybe that's a question in a moment for Devry. And for Miguel, Nadia asked, do you know of any public initiatives in New York State to prevent food waste? So Anne, can I circle back to you? What can Karen do?
I mean, I would start with just understanding the underlying issues. I mean, I think that this is a much more complicated space than it seems like. At least, that's how it has been for me over the course of the past 7 some odd years that I've been working in this space. I think that there's a lot of emerging research about barriers to accessing food assistance and why people do and do not access food assistance, and both public and private food assistance, and what are kind of some of the barriers there. And I think there's a lot to learn in that body of research. And the more you can read about it and the more you can understand the complexities of the problem, I think the better equipped you are to figure out what makes sense in your community.
Thanks. Devery, do you have some thoughts for Will on what companies can do?
Yeah, sure. And I just want to say, I do want to take a moment to underscore that choosing government out of school is a really bold move. And so, Anne, I want to congratulate you, because I would like to see more young talent go into government. We need it. There's been sort of a great sort of holing out of government. And there's this misperception that we don't have, hard workers or knowledgeable folks. And actually we do, lots of folks like Anne. So I want to commend you on choosing to go there right out of the gate. This is why, so for Will, nice to meet you. Please follow up if you'd like. This is why I founded the company, Devery BV Sustainable Strategies, is so, after all this time in industry, it's become abundantly clear that there is absolute revenue generation in putting these ESG, so the environmental, social, and the governance questions at the center of the business strategy. And so the companies that embrace that and back up and say, okay, this is the game board for how we're going forward. These are the types of investments that are going to come onto the game board, because we've decided that, yes, we get it. We're in a capitalist society, profit matters, but we start with the societal and environmental impacts. And there are numerous businesses I can point out that are starting that way. And I think there's a benefit for some of these companies because they start that way. Others are now trying to reshape themselves into that. And my observation, having been in a large global matrix organization, is that those companies need to get out of their own way. Because they're getting disrupted, and they've got to find a way to go back and say, wait a second, what's our purpose? So I'm broadly answering your question, Will. If you'd like to follow up, we can, because there's lots of opportunity there. And as students coming out, please don't just think you should have to go to the startups. Some of these other traditional players really need a groundswell of that kind of mentality, because they're already embedded in the infrastructure, the food system, and the change needs to happen much more swiftly with some of those folks.
Miguel, New York State programs well. What can you tell Nadia about public initiatives to reduce food waste?
Yes, Nadia, thank you for the question. So many programs and food waste reduction goes hand in hand to food security. So there are many programs. Of course, the Department of Agriculture and Markets of the New York State administers and applies grants to the federal government to distribute, to manage funds, to purchase foods across the state, to supply those in need. In many cases is, for example, the Farm to School program and other types of programs that are very important in New York State. But also you see a lot of private activity in terms of what Devery just mentioned, the investment in controlled environment agriculture. Mm-hmm. Call it vertical farms or factory farms or greenhouses located in the communities in need, and sometimes with very specific business models, in some cases owned by the communities where they are in urban areas, are models that are startup businesses that are taking off. But also we see, for example, to Anne mentioned before, we have programs. Our food bank network in New York State is extremely strong. I just have to mention that the first time I went to a food bank, I was expecting to have a little garage with a few volunteers working, and this was, and it wasn't even one of the biggest, but for me, it was like going to a warehouse of any modern retailer. So it was really a big operation. So programs, for example, that are being implemented, supported by the state, like gleaning programs, meaning harvesting all the products that are left in the farms, which are about 6% of the food waste. Of everything that is harvested, 6% is left in the farm because it wasn't beautiful or it wasn't ripe enough. There are businesses collecting this produce and distributing through the food bank sector. And there are many technology companies developing food meals and repurposing food from the commercial sector to communities in need for these communities to have access to a healthy diet. So if you want to follow up with me, I will be happy to give you more specific information.
Yeah, excellent answers. Thank you. Deborah, your comments remind me of the history of addressing iodine deficiency problems. My very first research on malnutrition as a brand new assistant professor was in a remote area in the high Atlas Mountains in Morocco, where we found an astonishing number of children with visible goiters. And when we collected iodine, collected urine to do iodine deficiency tests, we found upwards of 90% of kids were deficient in iodine, which is unimaginable to those of us in the US, because we solved that problem in the food system. So iodine deficiency was the leading cause of mental impairment worldwide, pretty much throughout recorded history, until in the early 20th century, and the US public health researchers realized that you could fortify salt with iodine. And for like a nickel a year, basically, you could solve this problem. And the industry, the food manufacturing industry, by fortifying salt with iodine in a single swoop, cured a massive public health problem and helped build a really huge market for themselves, generating sustained profits for some time. We just need to think creatively about how can products be reformulated to solve problems rather than create problems, which maybe is a segue to a couple other questions we have. So the first, which I'll ask Devery to tackle, I'll go through a couple of questions again. How do you best address conflict of interest problems in the private sector? Professor Gomez referred to their increasing role in the fresh food sector, but I'm curious if the same progress can be expected when looking at ultra-processed foods. So that'll be a question for you in just a moment, Devery. And then another question we got is perhaps for Miguel, who I know has done some work in this space. Can you comment on whether vertical farming is attractive, whether this is a more beneficial way than traditional farming? And finally, this maybe is a question you can combine, Devery, with your private sector conflicts of interest question. There's often a misalignment between profit maximization incentives in the private sector and environmental, public health, and nutritional objectives of the public sector. What are your strategies to more closely align those incentives? And maybe you can pick up on that as well. Can I circle back to you, Devery, on these issues of aligning incentives and conflicts of interest?
Yeah, and it's you go to the heart of the issue. One thing you talk about iodine, but one thing we haven't just broadly talked about is the nutrition, and especially not just coming out of COVID. COVID's still making its way around the world. Nutrition has come up to the top of the dialogue, and so we've been at it for a long time, haven't we? And so it's why I have started to make the case that more actors need to be at the table beyond the traditional players. That's the first thing. So quickly, I've jotted down the policy. We need more players in the policy formation process. Innovation is sort of combating some of that conflict of interest. And so what's happening is not just the innovation, but the market acceptance from consumers. So with that then comes sort of a grand pivot of some of those who have been less willing to actually get out of their own conflict of interest or their rent-seeking behaviors. Capital deployment against that innovation, and we're seeing that happen as well. And then unique partnerships. So we're seeing some of that happen. And what's really making some of those that are focused more on profit and doing things the same way, what's making them uncomfortable is that these outside players are starting to come in and deploy a lot of capital, but also interest in how we transform and evolve the food system. There's a lot of good. Let's just back up for one moment, because Miguel, you did mention the private sector role. There is so much good being done by the private sector, but there is also a great amount that needs to be changed. And as it relates to the evolution of humanity, our children having better lives than we have. And then the profit maximization one, again, like we've been at this for a long time. What's the right formulation for sort of governance of society and markets? And I come back to, and I'm on a board of something called Table for Moral Capitalism. I come back to capitalism with the moral element, and companies, again, it's why I'm dedicating my time to this, doing the work to say, yes, we know there will be profit, but let's back up and put it through the lens of our responsibility to society and the environment. And where this changes, where you really go to the heart of addressing conflict of interest, is that government plays its role and private sector plays its role. And we as the citizens or civil society play our role, that we are all responsible for the outcomes here. And so the challenge has been that the government and private sector roles sometimes get merged. And so that's why we need more players to sit down and say, what is the right governance structure for our food system, a food system that works for everyone, not just some.
Anne, do you want to pick up on that briefly?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, because I think that was a fabulous answer. I'll just add, there is a large and growing body of literature on the impact of various policies on food security. There's a lot of really, really good people in government at universities working on these questions and looking at, how do food taxes impact food security? How do gleaning operations impact food security? Or tax incentives for gleaning operations? And some of these, these different policies that have been put forth by governments that are intended to align incentives for companies. And I think we're seeing just a wealth of research on how those policies are playing out in terms of food security. So just keep an eye on that research.
Great, thanks for flagging it. Miguel, what about vertical farming?
Vertical farming, as Deborah mentioned, there is lots of interest from the investor community to invest in some sort of control environment, call it factory farms, vertical farming, greenhouses, etc. Unfortunately, sometimes these investments happen without enough knowledge about the particular context, the particular markets, and the particular advantages or disadvantages. So in my opinion, we have done several studies in several metro areas, and vertical farming in particular will make sense under certain conditions and for certain products, but it's not clear that it has advantages over everything. Even in terms of emissions or energy use, is not clear yet. We need talent to understand these issues, to understand the business model that will work in which cases. So,
excellent. So we have just a couple of minutes left. What is your 30-second take-home message for our audience today, Anne?
I think the most important thing on my mind, at least right now, is the barriers and what is preventing people from making use of food assistance that is already available and services that are already available. And I think that the better we understand that, and the better we understand what is preventing people from accessing what we've tried to make available, the more progress we can make.
Thank you, Anne. Deborah, how about you? What's your short takeaway for our audience?
Well, the short takeaway for anyone who's entering the industry coming from Cornell is you can be anything you want to be. And then I will drive home my second message, which is we need more players beyond the traditional food industry at the table. And if I had my way, we would have a food security expert in every company because food security, hidden hunger is an issue no matter what community you're doing business in. So become part of the solution.
They all have a workforce as well as a host community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Miguel, you want to close us off with your takeaway message?
Yes, and mine was very similar to Deborah, so I won't repeat, but I will mention another one. I think one of the biggest challenges in which we need innovation is how to balance the profitability of any business in the food business with food security, meaning how do we make sure as an industry that all the people that we serve have access to healthy diets. And that goes to the question of ultra-processed foods, that we are able, the challenge of solving the triple burden of malnutrition, that you have at the same time huge incidence of obesity, 2 billion people with micronutrient deficiencies, as Chris mentioned still, and as Debbie mentioned, we still have 800 million people that just don't eat enough. So all these problems require talent and talent based on good business models.
Well, on behalf of all of our listeners, let me profusely thank Debbie, Anne, and Miguel for what has been, I think, a really fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot from listening to the three of you today and really enjoyed it. So thank you all very much. This audience has benefited from your generous sharing of your time and your wisdom. Keep doing great and impactful work. We admire and appreciate you and all you're doing. So thank you, and thank you to the audience for your interest and for taking time to tune in. Stay well, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.